Chapter 11: Evolution and its Processes. I think I'm probably not wrong, assuming that some of you came here with preconceived notions about what evolution is and what I was going to ask you to think about and how I was going to ask you to think. Let me first, hopefully, alleviate some fears. I'm not going to ask you to not believe in your God. Um, I'm going to ask you to believe that maybe your God is bigger than you thought. Maybe he did some things you didn't realize. Because evolution is nothing short of miraculous. Evolution created this. This is the reality of life. All of this variety, prokaryotes, eukaryotes, cells, all of the things out there that you see out there, all of this life, all this diversity, um, in all its diversity, there is lots of things all of this life has in common. It's all based on the same nucleic acids, the same proteins, to the point that there are proteins that we use in our bodies to do stuff in our bodies that look an awful lot like the protein that does the same thing in a bacterium. It's amazing to see. Um, our breathing, the way we breathe, the mechanism on its molecular level is the same way the earthworm breathes. It's the same thing. It's amazing how by modifying some things a little bit, tweaking some things a little bit, things developed in different ways over time, over millions of years. And life was able to adapt to the different niches in the world that existed. And as those niches were changing, life changed with it. If that's not a miracle, then I don't know what a miracle is. So let's go see how this miracle actually works, the miracle of evolution. So what we know, right? We know is that the basic building blocks of all of these things are the same things. Same nucleic acids, same proteins, same fats, the same phospholipid membranes, lots of the proteins are the same. So clearly there's a lot of things that we have in common. But clearly there's a lot of things that they're different too, right? Um, and for the longest time, people just, how do you explain such a thing? Well, the first person or he probably wasn't really the first person. He was probably just the first one who got published. Things like that tend to um, come together in a time. Conversations tend to happen at different places at the same time. And so it's not necessarily just one person that was the first one. That was the one that managed to get the paper out first, or whatever it was. But there were conversations going on at that time, trying to explain some of these observations, because that's what evolution is. Or natural selection is. It's a way to explain the observations, the reality that we have. And so this particular story, um, with Darwin and his finches, is that Darwin went to an island, and on this island he saw finches. And this island was far, far away from the mainland, so the fact that there was even finches there to start with was kind of weird. Um, and then what he saw there, finches were the only kind of bird on that island. Um, and what he saw is that there were finches that were they were very different looking from the finches that he saw on the mainland. And when he looked at those finches, it looked like they were specialized to eat different foods. And so you would say things like, somebody could say is that, yeah, see, this finch here, it's specialized. It got a small beak so it can eat small little seeds. No, that's not how it works. So here's how it works instead. So you've got the finches. Let's say they come over and they all look like the number 2 finch. So let me make a little arrow here on the number 2 finch. Pen, number 2 finch. So let's say they all look like this. They're all coming, and the first thing you got to remember is that there's always competition for space and for food. The more of the more of you there are, if there's just a few of you, this is not a non-issue, right? But if there's more of you, the more of you there are, the more competition there is for food and space and the girl. So everybody looks the same. Everybody is eating the same kind of seeds. And so there's competition for these seeds, right? So the bigger bullies, those are the ones who tend to win, right? So they, bully the other ones out of the way, and so there's a population of birds that can be sustained from these. Let's say there's 100 birds and there's 100 seeds a day. So there's a population of 100 birds that can be sustained on this island from these seeds. Well, there may be other things on this island too. There may be a little fruit of some sort that has like a very narrow entrance that these seed eaters here can't get to. Well, they can't do anything with the fruit. The fruit just sits there and rots. Or maybe some, lizard or whatever eats or some insect eats the fruit. Well, one day there's a mutation in one of the birds. And one of the birds, when they're born, they have like this little skinny little beak. Now, if there's nothing to eat there other than the seeds that require that bigger beak, if there's nothing to eat there but those seeds, this little guy's going to die. End of little guy. False start, didn't work. But if there's a food source that these guys aren't competing for, and this is the only guy who actually explores that food source, then this little guy just had an advantage. It's all about advantages and disadvantages. So this part of the population that can eat that other food source, they now have a niche. They now have a place that they found where they're not competing for anyone else. So this island may support 100 of these guys because that's only 100 of those seeds that are around. But it may support 200 more of these guys, 500 more of these guys. No, depending on how much food there is for these guys. You see how that's happening? If there's not food for them, if they're competing for the same foods and they're not as good at it, they're going to die. But if there's a niche for them and they can explore the niche, then they can be successful. And so what happened is on this island, all the niches that were taken over by other organisms on the mainland, right, where there was maybe a lizard or a different kind of bird or whatever, those finches, though they found those niches. They didn't cover all of them, right? But there were some niches that were covered by finches. So at some point, there was one that had a little bigger beak, and they found some kind of a seed that these guys couldn't go after and these guys couldn't go after, but this guy could crack. And so they had yet another niche. So that's what it's all about. It's about finding niches. It's about having successfully being able to successfully hide yourself, like survive, right? Thrive, like eat, and then reproduce. Those are the things you've got to be able to do. And if you have a different food source from somebody else, that allows you to do that. So that's the idea of natural selection. Um, Now, some of the terms that they talk about in the book is this whole idea of descent with modification. So, a couple of things you need to know about natural selection. Natural selection works because three things are in place. One, characteristics have to be inherited. Only heritable characteristics can be selected upon. If it's not heritable, then it doesn't get selected by natural selection. Um, the second thing is you have to have more offspring than you need for survival. Because if you just have enough offspring for survival, you don't have any. You got to be able to have a little bit to play with, right? Where you can mess up. Because most of the time, those mutations, those little trial and error things, most of the times they're wrong. Most of the time it goes wrong because basically organisms are well-oiled machine. And I read somewhere that if evolution were true, or the odds of evolution being true is kind of like somebody shooting a shotgun into a broken engine of a car and hoping that it'll fix itself. And that's not untrue. What evolution has on its side, though, it's time. This happens over millions of years, and we see it happening today. We see it happening in real time today, and we're gonna talk a little bit about that. Um, and so the third item is that the offspring has to vary in their characteristics, right? Populations, there has to be variation in the characteristics. If there's not variation, if everybody's the same, then everybody's going to die based on the same environmental insults that come over you. This is an example of the ongoing evolution and natural selection that keeps on happening. So this image on the left shows you the beak size, the beak depth in millimeters from here to here, from 6 millimeters to 14 millimeters. And you can see here, so this is the percentage of individuals in each class. So only about 1% or so of individuals have a 6 millimeter beak, and very few have a 14 millimeter beak. And most of the individuals in the group seem to kind of, there seems to be sort of an ideal that surrounds kind of this number here, right? So, like between 8.5 and 10.5 seems to be about right. And that seems to be where, you know, the biggest part of the number, the biggest number of birds actually falls into. Now, 1977, there was a drought that caused the number of small seeds available to finches um, to be unavailable for a while. And so the small beaked finches died. They were gone. Well, so that gene for small beaks left the population, just wasn't there anymore. And so what you see now is you see um, there's not that tail. Um, there's now a couple of distinct ones that survived for some reason, but there's not that large tail, and the average number of larger birds has shifted off to the right. So the mean beak height, yeah, went from about 9.5 to about 10 millimeters in size because you took away, right, the smaller beak sizes that died because of the drought. Plants are pretty amazing creatures. The genetics of plants are amazing. When you look at, and you see this a little bit if you're in Bio 113, you'll see this in Bio 113. We look at the basic building plans of plants, and it is amazing how the same basically structural plan um, can be modified in so many different ways. Um, with actually very small modifications in their genes is really fascinating. Now, one of the great examples of the natural selections and the plasticity of natural selection, how it changes from over time and how it can modulate back and forth depending on the environment. So there are these peppered moths. The peppered moths come in two color varieties. They come in a lighter color version and a dark colored version. And they tend to live on birch trees, which are light colored. In England, um, prior to the Industrial Revolution, birch trees were white. And so what you see here is that the original population there were a very large number of organisms that were moths that were the lighter color, and a very small number. So let's say whatever this time point here, wherever it was, you had very many of the large or of the lighter colored ones. You had very few of the dark colored ones. But then the Industrial Revolution happened. And then after the Industrial Revolution happened, they didn't really clean the air all that much at that time. So everything was fired with coal. So everything became really dark because there was soot everywhere. It darkened all the trees, the buildings, everything. And so because the environment was darker all of a sudden, these light colored moths stood out like a sore thumb on trees, whatever they landed on, and so they got picked out specifically by the birds that saw them more easily than the dark ones, and so all of a sudden you saw more dark ones than you saw light ones. Um, this happened over time. Um, But then later on, 70s or so, people started putting laws in place to clean the air because, breathing is a nice thing. And as that happened, the original population actually recovered because both of them, there wasn't a bottleneck that happened. It wasn't like a gene just completely disappeared from the gene pool. These are just two color varieties that exist next to each other. And one of them just becomes more prevalent in the gene pool than the other one. So that's really all there is between those two. Um, what can also happen, which is what I just um, alluded to, is this idea that sometimes what can happen is that there can be a selection that for some reason favors a gene or another. Um, and if there is a situation where, for some reason, whatever reason that may be, um, you have a situation where these guys here which have the little a, let's say they don't reproduce, these don't reproduce for some weird unknown reason, and all of a sudden you have a bottleneck where only two rabbits that have the same genetic makeup reproduce, then everybody from then on looks exactly the same way. And that's called a bottleneck. So, a genetic bottleneck is when something catastrophic happens, and usually it's that something catastrophic happens that takes the population down to very, very few individuals. Um, because by having very few individuals, that means your genetic variety is very, very small. And this is one of the problems we run into when we're looking at trying to recover populations that are at the edge of extinctions. So the cheetah, for example, was at some point at the edge of extinction, probably prior to us actually recognizing it. But one of the things that we know about the cheetah is that the male sperm of the cheetah is just in atrocious shape. They have a really, really hard time reproducing. They basically can't do it without help. And we suspect that that's because at some point there was a bottleneck. And then there's very, very little genetic variety between cheetahs. So all the errors and things that happens between siblings, and everything that can go wrong went wrong with that sperm. So bottlenecks are difficult to overcome. You need genetic variety. Um, in order to make sure, you've all probably heard of the idea of the hybrid vigor. The hybrid vigor comes in because you're bringing in new genetic material. You're not mixing in the same problems and remixing the same problems over and over again. Um, a lot of what this chapter talks about is basically terms and definitions, things like gene flow and allopatric speciation and founder effect. Those are terms I want you to learn just so that you know what they mean. Um, but I really want you to understand more conceptually how evolution happens and how it comes about. Um, let's talk a little bit about the evidence for evolution. One of the things that I think is fascinating is when you're looking at skeletons, between different skeletons, um, they're basically variations on the same theme. There is this idea, nature is a tinkerer, not an engineer. So the same building plan just gets restructured a little bit, and tweaked a little bit, and all of a sudden it's something completely different. And so when you're looking at comparative anatomy, for example, when you're looking at the human versus the dog versus the bird versus the whale, it's the same. Those structural, those different bones, those are structurally the same, and we oftentimes we have um, the creatures that are in between, right? We have the fossils that are in between, the missing links between some of those organisms. Speaking of missing links, one of the images that you find in the book is the development of the horse. Um, and sometimes we think of these things as like a straight line, right? That there's like this Eohippus that just then, became bigger and stronger and faster and whatever, and then all of a sudden it came to this Przewalski horse. Well, that's not what happened. There were probably lots and lots of little, sidelines and false starts and things that didn't work, and something developed that had a longer neck, and something went wrong. The blood pressure couldn't handle it, so couldn't handle this thing, didn't work for some reason. Um, it's only the selection of things that were that were the things that survived, that beat out the other organisms. That was the thing that survived. That was the winner. Um, and what the winner ended up with, those winning features. Some of the winning features were, for example, teeth that could grind up grasses. Um, because by being able to grind up the grasses, they were able to use grasses as nutrition. But they also needed grasses first before this could ever happen. And grasses are kind of a magical kind of plant because grasses are one of the few plants that you can eat from the top. You can cut from the top and it doesn't kill them. In the case of a lot of plants, if you cut them on the top, that's where the growth cone is, right? So they stop growing and they're up. It's over. With grasses, that's not the case. And so grasses and horses, they sort of developed together. Um, and then once you're on the prairie, once you're eating the grass, then all of a sudden running fast is probably a good plan, right? Because it's a little difficult to hide yourself on the prairie. So chances are to try to get away from the other guy who's after you. If you are somebody who can run faster, if your eyes are at the side of your head so you can see better in all directions, those are the kinds of things that are going to allow you to survive. So that's the horses are built for survival in that particular niche of the environment. That's how this whole thing works. I already talked about that. Similar thing. There's environmental pressures that in some cases there are environmental pressures that are so strong that basically everybody succumbs to them. So in the Arctic, for example, it tends to be pretty white year round and pretty cold year round. So the organisms that survive there tend to be pretty white, at least during the winter times. And then they have features that allow them to conserve energy, to conserve heat. If you look at a desert fox, it's got huge ears because it uses them for to allow heat exchange. Well, this little guy here, this little desert fox here, this Arctic fox, not desert fox, this Arctic fox has itty bitty little tiny little ears because it doesn't want any kind of heat exchange with the outside. So the other thing that's interesting in terms of proof for evolution or proof for the fact that something developed over time is I don't know if you've ever looked at a globe before. The very first time I looked at a globe, I didn't know anything about anything, and I was like, "Huh, look, these pieces here, they kind of look like they fit together." And then if you with a little bit of fantasy, this over here, you could take this and kind of bend it and kind of squeeze it a little and stuff it together and make it into one. And then, down here, it requires a little more of a, but those things could, you squeeze them a little, those could fit together too. Um, so it didn't come as a huge surprise to me when somebody at some point said, "Yeah, plate tectonics, it's a thing. These, plates on the continents, they shift around on the Earth." Um, and I'm just like, "Yeah, no, that sort of looks like what it looks like." And it turns out not just the geography looks like that. But when you look at the plant life that's there, the plant life that you see here that developed prior to the split of the two continents. Um, there's plant life that's the same, and then from then on, it developed separately, because they didn't mix and mingle anymore, right? One of those, great examples of something that didn't mix and mingle anymore, obviously, is Australia, right? Where we find all the marsupials, that didn't really have much a chance, um, against the onslaught of the mammals, that basically won out basically everywhere else, except for Australia, where basically all the niches were covered with marsupials, um, until humans brought, the mammals in, and that was the end of a lot of them. The rest of the chapter talks a lot about speciation. And speciation is one of those things where whether something is a species or not is oftentimes up to definition, because depending on, whether they're at the same. When I was young, we were told two species don't, they can't reproduce and produce fertile offspring. Well, that's not true, because if you have two species that are just at different locations, they're still two species. And in some cases, they can actually produce fertile offspring. So um, it's more complicated than that. So read through it, um, understand some of the terms, understand that in a lot of times when species, like two different species, mate with one another, that there may not necessarily be fertile offspring, but because the chromosomes may not match, it may actually require a second mating for the chromosomes to match. Um, we'll get to that in one of the later pictures. Um, and then, this is one of the ways that, Darwin thought that elephants were related to each other. Sometimes species are separate because they're just at different locations. Um, then there's this term of the adaptive radiation, where one species turns into a couple of different, you know, just develops into a couple of different branches, right? Um, and every body has different characteristics. Those are just terms to know. Um, Autoploidy, we don't see that with polyploidy. We don't see that much with, or not much successfully, with animals, but we see this very successfully with plants. A lot of the very showy plants that we look at today, those are very those are the kinds of those are oftentimes polyploid. So they have multiple copies of the of sets of chromosomes. Um, and these differences in chromosomes in between species, that's what causes the problems in mating, and sometimes the inability to have viable offspring. But sometimes it's possible if you've got a second mating that happens. You sometimes can actually make it happen. The book then goes on to talk about misconceptions. And that's one of the sections I really like about the book. Um, it's not just a theory, it's the best explanation we have. First of all, theory in science means fact. But the reality is, it's the best explanation we have for the reality that we see. Um, when people try to disprove evolution, they oftentimes say something about, oh, I've never seen a duck turn into a whatever. That's not how it happens. Individuals don't evolve. We learn to, oh, yeah, they learn to swim. No, no, that's not how it happens. Um, populations evolve. It's populations. Populations change. There's variations in population, and then there's, if that ability existed within the population, then um, a part of the population has an advantage over another part of the population. Um, Evolution does not explain the origin of life. Evolution does not try to explain the origin of life. Evolution explains the variety, um, and the diversity and the commonality of all life that exists. It does not explain how life came about to start with. Um, Organisms do not evolve on purpose. There's no purpose behind it. What happens is the event of the change, the mutation, is usually an error in how genes are transcribed. And in most cases, those errors are detrimental and they will kill the organism. This is why we need more offspring than we have parents, in order to make sure we can throw a couple of them away where it didn't work. Um, so bacteria, for example, if you have bacteria on a petri dish, like if you have bacteria in somebody's body who has never had a single antibiotic before, um, are they potentially resistant to antibiotics? And the answer is yes. You just wouldn't be able to tell which one is and which one isn't. If I were to, spit out a bunch of bacteria onto a plate, and I would tell you one of these is resistant to an antibiotic, you would not be able to tell the difference. They all look the same. The only way you can tell the difference is if you put it on a plate that had antibiotics on it, and then one of them grows. That's the one that was resistant. The rest of them died. But the odds of there being one that's resistant, it could happen anywhere at any time. Once you have one bacterium in your body that's resistant, it'll pass it on to all the others. So once you have one, passing on to the others is a completely different story. So you don't want that. You don't want to be resistant to any of them. But that's how evolution works. It has to be a characteristic that, like, if no bacteria, like if I give you antibiotics and you have no bacteria whatsoever that are resistant to it, not even a little bit, then all the bacteria are going to die at once and none of them are going to survive. But the reality is you have a population of bacteria. So on the first day when you take the antibiotic, it kills almost all of them. And the second day, it kills 80% of those. And the third day, it kills 50% of those. And on the fourth day, it kills whatever, right? And if you stop now, what you have left is the 3 strongest bacteria you have. And if you stop now, those bacteria will make more. And the next time you come with the same antibiotic, your bacteria are better at fighting you. You have just made your bacteria stronger because you selected for them. That's how antibiotic resistance works. The next thing they talk about is that evolution is controversial amongst scientists. That is not the thing. Every scientists believe in evolution. It's not a belief; it's a fact. Scientists who are Christians believe in evolution because it's not a belief; it's a fact. And no, other theories should not be taught because there are no viable scientific theories other than the theory of evolution that we all agree on in the sciences. And personally, I think it's an amazing thought to think that whoever created life, however it came about, um, built in a mechanism that allows change. And I find that fascinating. And on that note, I'm going to stop talking about evolution.